Well, welcome back to the plenary stage, or so to speak. I hope you're enjoying this first day of the annual research meeting and have had a chance to participate in breakout sessions. I don't know if you noticed, but this year you had a mix of both live sessions and recorded ones compared to last year, which was all recorded. I hope you've also visited the posters. There's some terrific presentations there, and especially check out the best poster nominations so you can vote on them. So now, as we turn to our closing plenary for today, we are going to focus on the changing nature of evidence, and what a lineup we have. This is going to be a great conversation. So it's my pleasure to introduce the session moderator, Tanisha Carino. Dr. Carino is the Executive Vice President and Chief Corporate Affairs Officer at Alexion. Tanisha, over to you.
Thanks, Lisa. And thank you, everybody, for joining us, no matter where you are. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening for maybe some of you out there. It is really delightful to be able to close this day one of the 2021 annual research meeting. I know this was one of my favorite meetings when I was getting my dissertation at Johns Hopkins, and I'm looking forward to contributing to the discussion today. So like Lisa said, we have an amazing panel. We have 60 minutes and it's going to go really quickly. So we want to jump right in. So the theme of the ARM this year is leading with evidence in the time of change. And there's no better session than this one to really reflect on the question of what is the changing nature of evidence? What's the data that we believe we're going to depend on moving forward in the future? How do we create a workforce that is able to optimize that data and to make better and better decisions faster? And then what is it that we need to build from a policy perspective to be able to really harness the data, but also to make well-informed decisions? So what I've asked each of my panelists to do is I'm going to do a quick introduction of our panelists, and I've asked each of my panelists to reflect in just a few minutes on this theme of the changing nature of evidence. So with that, let me start off with Peter Emby. Peter, thank you so much. You're the president and CEO of Regenstrief Institute. For those of you that don't know who Regenstrief Institute is, the Regenstrief Foundation and the Regenstrief Institute were established by Sam and his wife Myrtle in 1969. They believed that modern advances in technology and processes in industry that made Sam successful could be applied to healthcare systems. The Institute was created as a medical research and a development organization focused on improving the quality of care, increasing efficiency in healthcare delivery, preventing medical errors, and enhancing patient safety. Peter, thank you for being with us today. And if you don't mind kicking us off with your initial thoughts.
Sure. Thank you, Tanisha. It's great to be here with you, and I'm really excited to be on this panel. So I will. Happy to just say a couple of words to help kick us off. I think it's an incredibly important topic and an exciting time with a lot of potential. I think we all have seen during this last year especially, but really growing over the last decade, the growing accessibility and availability of data that is improving all the time. And what that means is that theoretically, it could position us to be able to enable more evidence generation using real world data. And there's great potential for good there, but there's also, I think, especially this community understands and appreciates the potential to maybe come to conclusions too quickly that may not be entirely accurate. Really, I think what we're talking about when we start to express some of the concerns here is really an issue of rigor. And I know that's very important to the Academy, and certainly it's something that we have to balance with the desire to generate that evidence and the desire to be accurate about it with the counter desire to more rapidly get that evidence into practice and have it benefit people. So with COVID, we found that we could overcome barriers, which has been amazing. But again, what has emerged is not necessarily the most rigorous work. So I think there is an incredible amount of work for this community to do in terms of balancing these competing interests. And I look forward to the further discussion we're going to have about how we strike that balance so we can better understand and be able to accelerate real world evidence generation.
Thank you, Peter. Carolyn McGill, you join us. You've spent 20 years addressing how we pay for healthcare. You're currently the CEO of Entrants, which offers a platform that turns real-world data into evidence to inform decisions on drug safety, efficacy, and value. Carolyn has spent a decade at United Health Group, where she led the plans for Medicare and Medicaid beneficiaries. She was the EVP of Payer Strategy and Operations at Evolent Health, and then later the CEO of Remedy Partners, with her team supported providers in taking on risks through bundled payments. Carolyn brings together all of these experiences at Aecon, which she works across the biopharma, the payer, the regulator, and HTA agencies to inform them of some of the most critical questions in healthcare, where interventions work best, for whom, and in what types of settings. Carolyn, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Happy to share some thoughts and build on what Peter shared. You know, we would say that the changing nature of evidence is that we now have credible evidence that we need to make high stakes decisions about safety, effectiveness, and value of clinical treatments. And there are a few things that are key. You heard Peter highlight some of the concerns that are out there. We have an opportunity now, because of the access we have to data and because of advancements in technology and scientific methodology for analyzing that data, to do a better job than we have historically. So we can ensure that we're using data that are fit for the purpose of the question that's being asked, that we're analyzing those data with a level of scientific rigor that follows best practices. And when we use technology, we can ensure that we introduce a level of transparency, of reproducibility. We have audit trails. We can be really clear on the assumptions we've made, so that as disparate parties or people that have different perspectives come in to evaluate the credibility of that evidence, we can poke holes in the way that we came up with our conclusions and say, hey, wait a minute, why did we look at 8 diagnosis codes instead of 10? Or what happens if we change the time period that we're evaluating? And these are the kinds of things that help to give us a level of confidence in the evidence that is at our fingertips today. And so by collaborating more, thinking about standards, and I know we'll talk more about that in our conversation, we're in a position to ensure that the evidence we create can truly inform the highest stakes decisions about who has access to which treatment when.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. And last but not least is Dr. Amy Abernathy. So most recently, Amy was the Principal Deputy Commissioner of Food and Drugs at the FDA, and helped oversee the agency's day-to-day functioning, directed special and high priority initiatives that cut across the agency's offices. She was also the Acting Chief Information Officer and oversaw the FDA's data and technical vision, as well as its execution. Under her tenure, she initiated multiple critical efforts that included FDA's technology and data modernization action plans and FDA's efforts to leverage real-world data during this last pandemic in the last 18 months. Amy is an internationally renowned oncologist, data expert, and digital health expert that has had a career spanning academia and the private sector, both as the Chief Medical and Chief Scientific Officer of Flatiron Health, as well as a professor at Duke University School of Medicine. And just recently it was announced that she will be joining Verily as the president of Clinical Research Platforms, but I do not believe she has joined quite yet. We have an outstanding panel. Amy, do you want to close our introductions by sharing your initial thoughts?
Thank you, Tanisha, and thanks for having me. So, you know, as I think about where this is going and our entire space around the rapidly changing nature of evidence, I really think we're moving in a direction of totality of evidence, right? We're looking at a world where it's not clinical trials or real world evidence and real world data, but how do all data come together, collected in a variety of settings to tell the total picture? I think it's not only cross-sectional pictures either. These are longitudinal pictures of how a product performs across time. So the language I think we'll see more and more, especially on the regulator side, is the language of totality of evidence and total product life cycle. And one of the advantages that I hope to see as we move in this direction is also more inclusive evidence. This is evidence that's going to really represent more of our total population in the United States and even worldwide. And so inclusivity will also be a key feature of evidence going forward. A couple of other features. I think we're going to see more patient-centric evidence, organizing data sets around individuals, but maintaining privacy-sparing techniques so that we have longitudinal representation of the patient journey that's going to help us understand both the medical products we're studying or healthcare delivery that we're studying, as well as how that impacts individuals. And I think the other thing we're going to see as a changing nature of evidence going forward is who are the partners. Carolyn highlights that we're going to have tech at the table as partners. I think regulators are going to be partners. As Peter highlighted, we're going to have to be really smart about the data and methods and transparency as we do rigorous work. And so we're going to have not only researchers as partners at the table with tech, regulators, health systems, et cetera, but we're all going to be teaching each other because the methods still need to be sorted out. But we have a lot to do. It's going to be fun.
Thanks, Amy. So we are excited to dive into this discussion. Just from a context perspective, we've divided the discussion into three themes. The first two themes, we're going to actually launch a poll. So not only is this panel going to interact with each other, but hopefully you're going to interact with us. And then we also wanted to make sure that we save 10 minutes at the very end for discussion and then for Lisa to close us out. So with that, maybe we can get our first poll up and running. The question is, as we think about how research to inform public health and healthcare decisions will be conducted in the year 2030, what do you believe will be the most predominant sources of data driving public health decisions, including decisions around medical products and new technologies? So with that, if you all can go to your phones and type in your answers, that would be great. Votes are coming in. I don't know if my panelists have the ability to select their answers, but you guys will have the ability to at least respond to what everybody else is saying. Okay. Trickling in, so maybe we give it 10 more seconds and then we'll close the poll for now and go ahead with our first topic. Okay, Amy, if you don't mind closing the poll, we'll go with what we have for right now. And I cannot see the results. Okay, give me a second.
The suspense.
The suspense. Okay, Amy, you may need to read the results because it's not coming up on my screen. Okay, so we have only two answers. So first, the first option was data from healthcare systems, claims in electronic medical records and encounter data. By 2030, only 15% of the audience that submitted answers thought that that is where the majority of the data would come from. 85% of you actually said that data from both healthcare and non-healthcare sources, economic, environmental data, et cetera, for example, even patient person level data would actually be the predominant source of data moving forward. So lots of people in the audience agreeing with you. So with that, Carolyn, maybe you can share your perspective. You've worked across the healthcare system. What do you believe are some of the most exciting trends related to the actual sources of the data, and what are you seeing?
Well, I think the audience is spot on in terms of what we expect to see. And you're right, having sat on behalf of a payer, on behalf of providers throughout the country, and now focused on data and technology, I get a sense of both what we have access to and what's missing in each of those seats. And I would say in today's world, we are quite siloed. We are looking at safety, effectiveness, and value of discrete interventions. You taking this one medication as an example. In tomorrow's world, we'll take a much more holistic view based on how we as human beings experience our lives. And I would just go back to what Lisa Simpson said earlier today in the opening, when she was saying we need to do a better job looking at the upstream causes of the negative outcomes that we experience and thinking about social determinants, systemic racism, the incentives and funding that might make some of what we're experiencing even more difficult to change. And we'll say that as we move forward, one of the most exciting trends is that instead of looking at something like a medication in isolation as an example, we'll start to look more holistically at an intervention. So we'll think about what happens when a patient takes a given medication and follows that with a given sleep or nutrition protocol. As payers, we'll look at treatments patients receive in combination with different kinds of care management outreach. Are we reaching out telephonically? Are we seeing people in person? What kinds of impact do those different interventions have? Not in isolation, but in combination with one another, because none of us only receives one type of care. We're also going to become much more holistic in how we look at patient populations. So wearables data, genomics data is an example, thinking about how to measure quality, thinking about the ways in which my behavioral health is linked to the medical care that I'm receiving. And I used to work in Medicaid where we looked at medical separate from dental as an example. And we know that there's a lot of need to combine the two. And then you put on top of that socioeconomic factors. So when we think about outcomes as we move forward, we're going to move beyond total cost of care or clinical quality indicators related to my cholesterol level or my blood pressure sort of in isolation. We're going to start defining quality much more broadly. Am I able to walk my daughter down the aisle at her wedding? How is my food security impacting my overall well-being? And all of those new data sources that Amy was just referring to will come into play, as will innovations in technology, natural language processing to capture notes as an example from clinicians, artificial intelligence, getting better at recognizing patterns in the data, and our ability to analyze more and more data to ensure that we're supporting more personalized treatment options.
Thanks, Carolyn. That was such a great answer and a really rich answer. And I know maybe Peter, you have a response to that too, sitting in your institution and seeing the data that is either missing or the data that is really there that to help make relevant decisions.
Yeah, I think the answer was a great one. Hard to add to it, but I'll give it a shot. I think that actually couldn't agree more with the crowd. The evolution of our data assets, while we have been and need to continue to leverage the clinical data that we do have and are collecting, we also need to be improving the ways in which we are collecting that information, because if we are increasingly going to use those data sources for developing real world evidence, then we need to make sure that they're actually being collected with an eye toward doing that. We recognize that we often collect data in the first place for different purposes than to be able to use that downstream for being able to actually generate evidence. And so there are caveats and considerations that we have to take into account when we use that. But we also recognize exactly what the crowd said. I think if we project into the future as you asked them to do, I don't think there's any question that we're going to be looking at myriad other data sources. And we already are starting to do that with social determinants of health, as was mentioned, and others. I think the other thing that we need to think through with regard to this is how we're then using those data and transforming them into solutions. And I think we'll get into this a little bit more moving forward. But for instance, we use that then to drive decision-making, to develop algorithms, to be able to actually then impact care through decision support and other means. And we have to have a good understanding of what the data, what the flaws are in the data, what they actually can be relied upon to tell us, and then how it is that we can sort of adjust and account for those so that we don't inadvertently sort of miss some of the inherent biases that can exist in those data sources. But I think there's an incredible wealth of data assets that are out there flowing around us all the time, oftentimes not being used for the really good intentions that I think we often have when we think about trying to leverage these for improvements in health and healthcare. And I think that's our obligation, to learn how to do that better.
Thank you, Peter. And we're going to get to this idea of the richness of the data and what tools like AI can be applied and what it can tell us. Amy, if you don't mind, I think that we can all agree that there's more data that's available for research than there's ever been. I know I looked at my iPhone this morning and I turned off a number of different apps that I didn't even realize was transmitting data to God knows where. And underlying this discussion is one of trust. You know, how do we create a trust between like patients and their data? You talked about privacy. What does that mean for you?
This is such an important part of this conversation of more available data and richness of data, because ultimately, you know, one side of the coin is we have a responsibility to continuously learn and continuously improve healthcare. And on the other side of that, we have a responsibility to do that in a way that maintains patient privacy and ensures that patients and just real people, all of us, understand what's happening with our information and have a legitimate voice in what that looks like going forward. I think two parts of this. One is that the conversation around trust is going to get more important and louder, and we should welcome that and actually embrace it and continue to work towards trustworthy methods. And I think the other part is we're going to see more and more innovation in the trust space. You know, one of the things I anticipate seeing by 2030 is, for example, sparing methods such as synthetic data sets that utilize artificial intelligence to generate data sets that have similar contours to currently available real world data sets, but still mask the individuals so that individual people cannot be identified. And there's going to be a number of innovations I anticipate coming down the line on the analytics side, on the data set generation side, and new tools. And I think we want to understand what's possible and then figure out how do we build those capabilities into our research frameworks and analytic frameworks going forward, and figure out how we can use those types of approaches in a trustworthy way in itself and get to reliable and credible results.
Thanks, Amy. And I think for me, you know, I get this beginning picture of the richness of data, of the ability as me as an individual to feel like I know where my data is flowing and going, you know. And I know, Peter, you are an expert in this area and a scholar. You recently wrote a JAMA article or commentary on this idea of, I'm going to get this wrong, algorithmovigilance.
You got
like,
it. Right.
Introduce that concept to this audience. What does that mean? Because you can't go to a conference without hearing the words AI, as if that is like the magic bullet for the future. But what are the watch outs for us, particularly as we think about health equity and wanting to ensure that the data that's being collected and how it's used doesn't further create inequities in our system?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we know that increasingly we are leveraging data assets to be able to create these algorithms, oftentimes that result in black box sort of solutions that we can't necessarily understand when we're using them in the real world, although sometimes we can. And it's very important that those not only are tested for performance against the data sets that were used to generate them, but we have to recognize that the data sets that are used to generate these algorithms come from current data, which represents current systems and current society. And in many ways then can be imbued with the biases and issues that we're facing in society today. And that's not just theoretical. We've seen more and more evidence of algorithms that were developed that unintentionally, in most cases, actually really inherit a lot of the biases and inequities of the system, so that then what they end up predicting or recommending end up being biased predictions or recommendations. And even with so along the way, the idea of algorithmovigilance is that we have to remain vigilant, much like pharmacovigilance, to the kinds of adverse events that can occur when you then deploy these algorithms into practice. And I think that's where, I think to Amy's point, more and more innovation is going to be needed to be able to not only ensure that we have rich and robust and representative data that go into developing these algorithms, but that they also then, once they go out into practice and they get deployed in different environments and applied in different ways with different workflows and to different populations, that they're actually having the intended effect that we expect them to have, and that they are not, importantly, having unintended effects. And that's why we wouldn't think of deploying, although we often do, we wouldn't think of deploying, a pharmaceutical or a device or what have you without, putting it through rigorous testing, but then also surveilling to make sure that in fact it's having the intended effect. And when we do that, how many times have we already learned that once you put it out into the world, it can have different impacts than you think it's going to have? That certainly is possible. And in some ways, I think even more likely with these black box algorithms. So it's just very important that those of us working in this area don't shy away from doing this, but actually see it as an ethical imperative to monitor for the kinds of impacts that these are having, and then make sure that we appropriately adjust so that we don't end up causing harm when our goal is really to heal.
Thanks, Peter. I know my other panelists probably have something they'd like to say too. Amy, why don't you go next, and then Carolyn?
Yeah, so as Peter was talking, one of the other parts that this hits upon for me that's near and dear to my heart is also cybersecurity. And when I saw Peter's paper around algorithm of vigilance, it brought to mind two issues. One is this kind of critical need for continuous life cycle evaluation of algorithms. And the other is to remember that the more digital our environments, the greater risk we are for bad actors to take advantage of our environments. And we saw this, in many different ways across the pandemic with concerns around ransomware and cybersecurity concerns. But one of the places that we're starting to see increased activity is in essentially data poisoning. So this general idea of adding in data that doesn't belong in the data sets, creating erroneous results, erroneous algorithms. And so we have a responsibility in our algorithm of vigilance to make sure that algorithms are performing as expected, and they haven't been corrupted in some way that we didn't expect. And I think we have a responsibility around this all the way.
I would build on that. Replicability, transparency, the reproducibility of analyses are critical. And so even as we are developing algorithms, as an example, creating methods to test them, or to test hypotheses that they generate to validate whether or not they are credible. This is something that we're doing today. And the other piece, of course, is looking at the source of our data. I mentioned before that, I was in Medicaid previously. Well, in that population, we think a lot about the uninsured as well, and how much of our appreciation for safety, effectiveness, value of clinical treatments relies on claims data. Well, adjudicated claims don't take into account the uninsured patients, as an example. So looking to open claims, it's not that hard to do. We also have access to open claims, but we have to be aware of the criticality of doing that. And then the other piece, of course, is geography. So even as we come up with algorithms that we have confidence in, going back again to think about, well, what are they reflective of? And recognizing that access to specialists, to mental health, even primary care, vary significantly, rural, urban, different settings around the country. And so ensuring that when we use data, we're thinking about the subgroups, and we're thinking holistically about some of those biases that might exist. And again, the more transparent we are about documenting the methodology that we're using and the assumptions we're making along the way, the better off we'll be at ensuring that we create a level of credibility in our conclusions.
Thank you to the panelists. Before we wrap up this section of the discussion, I wanted to ask any of you to comment on the policy environment. We have come a long ways in terms of HIPAA, in terms of rules against data blocking, to allow for the flow of data. Like, where's the next generation of policies that we think are going to support some of the themes that we've come up with already, whether it's privacy themes, cybersecurity, data flow? Where do we feel like there is more work to be done?
So I'll start. I think that there's clearly a set of policy themes in the real world data, real world evidence space, similar to the conversation that's happening in Washington around Cures 2.0 and increasing the mechanisms to allow for the use of real world data reliably and credibly in a variety of decisions by regulators. I think, though, that that space, it still needs this community to get the methods right, because one of the challenges is advancing real world data and real world evidence, and then having that move too fast when the methods may not have had a chance to catch up yet. And one of the other challenges I see is that we sort of waiting for when the methods catch up and are done. And we actually have to come up with mechanisms that accommodate for the fact that data sets are continuously going to keep getting better. And the space is going to continuously keep updating. And how do we create a policy landscape that accommodates for that?
And, you know, Tanisha, you're familiar with the Rwe Alliance, which is an organization we recently formed specifically for the purpose of thinking about how to advance FDA's RWE framework and the great work that Amy and others have been doing for years at the agency. And so thinking about how we can encourage use of RWE to better understand treatment effects in underrepresented populations as an example. You know, we expect to see more collaboration, interagency collaboration. So CMS with FDA as an example. And we also expect to see policies that help to encourage communication and sharing of data across settings and sources.
Yeah. And Carolyn is referencing the Rwe Alliance that was announced on May 19th. It was spearheaded by 5 digital health companies, including Aetion. I'm going to mess this up, but it's Aetion, Flatiron, Synapse. Who else is in there, Carolyn? There's 2 more signatories.
Yeah,
Tempus.
did you say IQVIA and Tempus?
Tempus. I will say what I think is really notable about the RWE Alliance is that these are big tech companies, right? Many of which grew up in a world outside of healthcare and came into healthcare, at least one of them. And what I would also encourage us to also make sure of is that any of these alliances keep the patient community at that center. Mm-hmm. Right? Because oftentimes it's the patient community that has, to Amy's point, the trust that's been built with their constituency to be able to be the hub and spoke of all of these different data sources of what the patients are feeling. We often say in the biotech world, from bench to bedside, the patient community thinks of it as bedside to bedside for them. And that's really reflective of a lot of the discussions I think we're having today. Peter, I don't mean to cut us off. I want to get into the COVID-19 discussion. Do you have anything you want to add in terms of the policy environment?
I completely agree with what was said. And I'm certainly not the regulator here. What I would just add and emphasize is actually something I heard both Carolyn and Amy allude to, which is that the sort of the principle of transparency and trust really underlying the development of these regulations. Even as I completely agree with Amy, you know, we can't get too far ahead before we really know what it is we're trying to do, and inadvertently have regulations that sort of slow us down too much. On the other hand, I think it is important to be able to get out ahead with principles around transparency that then enable trust. And, you know, again, just picking on the concept of algorithms going out into practice, while there's a balance to be struck between the desire inevitably for protection of IP and making sure that, you know, companies have a good interest in being able to sort of develop and innovate, that has to be balanced with the need for enough transparency to be able to really understand what is behind that, what's actually driving those algorithmic decision-making tools, so that we can make sure we keep people safe. And I don't think it's too soon to have that discussion.
Thanks, Peter. So we're going to go to our second poll. I hope everybody is ready to participate. The question is, what were the biggest surprises coming out of COVID-19 on the role of evidence? And the choices, if I have my notes correct, are A, sources of credible scientific information, B, public understanding of the scientific process and the nature of evidence generation and uncertainty, and C, the availability of data and evidence in which to base decisions. So hopefully everybody's answering the poll. We have votes coming in. I don't know if my colleagues on the panel want to weigh in and put the thumb on the scale for any one of these answers, but I'm looking forward to hearing how each of our panelists have navigated the last year.
It wasn't an all of the above option.
Right, exactly. Institutions, right? So while we are waiting for votes to come in, I'm actually going to start with Peter and then round back up to the poll results. Peter, you know, Reagan Street is at the heart of delivering care, doing research. You know, give us your perspective about the biggest lessons learned that you saw.
Well, I think clearly, the one that's at the top for me is just how remarkably fast we and others were able to move to really get barriers out of the way, to enable the kinds of data exchange, the kinds of implementations of technological solutions, the agreements that we were able to strike very quickly between organizations, between different industries, government, academia, et cetera, to be able to pull together. I can tell you here in Indiana, it was really remarkable. Very early in the pandemic, we launched the Indiana Pandemic Information Collaborative, which was this group that actually brought together people across the different sectors in the state to be able to make sure that we weren't duplicating effort, that we were working together to overcome barriers, and that we were doing everything we could to exchange the data necessary for decision makers to be able to make the best decisions and keep our population as safe as possible, and have good data-driven decision-making happening at the level of the state and the counties and the health systems that we're all working so hard to keep everyone safe. And I think it really had a really big effect. So one of the things that we are really focused on is working hard to make sure that we don't revert back to the previous state. There are certainly some things that probably happened quickly enough that they might need to be modified or rolled back, but a lot of the things we were able to achieve have resulted in really remarkable advances that taught us two things. One is that we can do it, and that when we sort of put our mind to it and all work together, we can get these things done, and that there are probably lessons about how we went about doing that we now want to kind of enshrine in our processes moving forward. And it was remarkable. Crises like this often illustrate kind of the best and the worst in people, and I saw a lot of the best coming out in our colleagues here in terms of working together. So to me, that was the highlight. I can certainly get into more details, but maybe just one other quick example I'll throw out is that we also saw a lot of innovation around the kinds of ways we went about collecting additional data that were necessary to fill the gaps that we otherwise couldn't fill with existing sources. So one was ready access to existing sources, being able to exchange that information and overcome the barriers. The other was, hey, we had gaps. So for instance, we created a citizen scientist app to have people out in the community go out and sort of track what was happening around them and be able to contribute additional data that then gave us a better sense of, how much were people, in an anonymous way, how much were people adhering to policies around mask wearing or things like that. So we would have a better idea of what was really happening in a way that was completely anonymous and protected people's privacy, but gave us additional data that we otherwise couldn't get. This is one example.
That's great. And I'm going to turn to Amy and Carolyn just a little bit. Before I do, Peter, you all launched this pilot that had 87,000 responses of people that were collecting symptoms.
Yeah.
What were you able to find in terms of the ability of us as researchers to truly engage communities at a time like this?
Yeah, thank you. That was another great example. My colleagues here, Brian Dixon and Sean Branis, worked with the university and Microsoft to actually do I think it was over 3 weeks. They had over 87,000 responses using online polls that were able to garner a lot of information that we otherwise couldn't have gotten from very different populations around what their symptoms were, how they were responding to the pandemic in their local area. And I think it just was another way of illustrating the kinds of innovative approaches that we can use when we're sort of pressed for coming up with new data sources. And I think that is another tool now in our toolbox to be able to use moving forward to augment the data. Now, there are, as my colleagues noted, there were some inherent biases in doing things that way. That's understandable. But I think it goes back to what Amy said around totality of evidence. I think that is now another source of information that we can leverage, just as citizen scientists created data or other data sources around social determinants and the like can all be brought together to paint a more full and complete picture. So I think we're going to start to see more and more of those. I'll also point out, depending on one of the things we learned with that is depending on the platform that you're using, you get different kinds of populations responding. So in certain social media platforms, you're going to, skew to a younger age population, for instance, than if you use kind of a news source like this one, which happens to skew a bit older. And I think those are the other things that our sort of academic community is going to need to get more knowledgeable about and facile with, so that then we can appropriately account for those differences and know that when we're using a particular tool or a particular capability, what are the things we have to adjust for.
Thanks, Peter. In reflecting over the last year, for me at least, we had such a rich period of creativity and openness to trying new things. We were almost in this period of time, everybody was throwing everything they could at the problem, and there was a real openness to failing and knowing that nobody had the right answer. That I hope that's something that we continue to take forward as a research community and a policymaking community. Amy, being in the FDA in the last year must have been quite a sleeper. I mean,
yeah, really.
Even before we even had therapeutics or vaccines in the bloom of the eye, there were questions about whether the FDA would be able to keep pace and be able to guard the public interest while also being able to respond to the pandemic. Tell us a little bit about some of the innovation you saw when it came to RWE that actually Carolyn was part of in terms of the kinds of partnerships FDA launched at that time.
So, it was interesting. I think being inside of FDA, what we saw was a renaissance of thinking as it related to how do we leverage the data around us to answer important questions. The challenge came in the form of several things. First of all, list of things to address, like questions to answer, was way longer than any one team could possibly address. Another one was that, places like FDA have long-standing relationships and contracts. But again, if the list of questions to answer is way longer than any one group can address, how do you create mechanisms that allow new entrants to come to the table quickly outside of sort of the usual kind of very slow RFP and contracting processes that big organizations need to take? And what happened was we leveraged a public-private partnership approach at really building off of FDA's congressionally mandated Reagan-Udall Foundation, which is the foundation for FDA, which gave a safe space to bring all actors to the table to try and address questions related to the pandemic through data. FDA created the list of questions so we could prioritize here the things that we needed to know, but then health tech companies, academic researchers, government organizations, nonprofits, the list goes on, we're able to now come to the table and work together. And a couple of critical lessons learned. The first was that the methods are not obviously ready yet. One of the things I heard very early on in the pandemic was, oh, come on, it's all observational research. We know how to do this. And in fact, the data sets are new. We do have standardized methods, but it's really important to put them in place within the context of the research questions that are sitting in front of us. And that importance of building the methods in a transparent way where many groups could quickly cross-check each other was a really important part of the methods development within the context of the pandemic. The second thing was this kind of criticality of transparency. We saw it through the Surgisphere debacle. We saw it in other ways that we need the ability to understand the data sets. We need the ability to understand the methods. We need the ability to quickly cross-check each other. And transparency is critical for credibility, and that we saw that over and over again. The third thing that I would say, and then I'm sure Carolyn has a number of additional thoughts to this, is that the regulatory side of this was also pretty interesting to watch emerge. So as part of the challenge as FDA is oftentimes FDA is sort of behind walls, right? And so ultimately something has to be put in front of the FDA after it's been fully baked, right? And the FDA didn't have a lot of chance to comment. And there's two problems with that. One is you got to do all this work before the FDA has a chance to comment. And what if the FDA doesn't agree with the work you're doing? And also the FDA doesn't have a chance to build the muscle, the thinking and understanding and internal capabilities that go along with that review. And so this leveraging of public-private partnerships and working together gave FDA the chance to be at the table to say, as the work was evolving, here's what we're thinking, but also to build the internal muscle and capability set that was going to need to go along with evaluation.
Thanks, Amy. Carolyn.
Yeah, I'd love to build on that. And we're so grateful for the Evidence Accelerator, the leadership of Amy, of Reagan-Udall Foundation, Friends of Cancer Research. And I know Peter and his team were very active in that collaboration as well. For us, probably the most welcome surprise of COVID was how much there was to learn in terms of advancing our understanding of real world data and real world evidence beyond COVID. And the learnings for us in our collaboration with FDA, as an example, also, related to some of the concerns or skepticism that maybe had existed previously. So one of the things that we hear from manufacturers that we work with is that I don't want to submit real world data to the agency because sometimes a reviewer accepts it. Sometimes the reviewer doesn't accept it. I don't know why. Is it worth I don't know why there's variability, as an example. And that uncertainty makes people less willing to try something new or do something that, goes beyond a clinical trial in a more historic sense. And I think what we found through our collaborations on COVID is that instead of, like Amy said, instead of having regulators kind of behind a wall looking at this finished product, they were able to say things like, hey, wait a minute, just saying that a patient is on an event doesn't mean the same thing in different contexts. And that means in this context, when we're collaborating together, that doesn't mean, oh, then I just have to disqualify that whole submission. Let's get that out of there because there's too much variability and I don't know what it represents. It means, hey, let's look at this a little bit more deeply and recognize that we just can't take things at face value. We have to collaborate. We have to be able to pressure test what we're seeing and see the extent to which it's reliable. And that way we're able to be really clear on the assumptions we're making and the skepticism that we have, and then identify areas where, yeah, there's agreement here. Great, let's move forward. Yeah, this still feels gray. So let's continue to evaluate this or get more collaborators at the table so that we really understand how to contextualize the data that we're seeing. And it's that kind of collaboration, I think, that is really helping us to advance our understanding of how and when to turn to data, and to do that in ways that will extend far beyond COVID-19.
Thanks, Carolyn. I have the survey results, and it actually really resonates with the discussion that we're having. So 21% of our survey participants said that what was surprising to them was the sources of credible scientific information. 66% of our survey results said public understanding of the scientific progress and the nature of evidence generation and uncertainty. And then the remaining, oh my goodness, let me gently scroll, 31% said that the data and evidence by which to make decisions. And the 66% that said it was the public's understanding of the scientific process, I think really resonates with me because we are on this panel, we're all researchers, many of us are all researchers on the call. We understand the iterativeness of evidence generation, the back and forth of understanding greater and greater context. But during the last year, we had an audience of everybody in the world watching us deliberate and not really following the thread oftentimes and needing clearer guidance to what is it the researchers are really saying. And this really sticks with me as we think about fast forwarding to the future, because if we don't mind making this transition, a lot of what we've seen in terms of the approval of vaccines is the public is starting to understand that the FDA has a role to play in being able to put technologies out there and continuing to learn with caveats to what they need to learn, right? And I think that in the last week, we saw the FDA respond to another big public health issue, which is Alzheimer's, with the approval of the first medication for Alzheimer's, the Biogen's product. And this is an approval that comes relatively controversial, where the evidence base may not be as strong as some clinicians want to be able to confidently prescribe the product. It is a very broad label. It screams for the role of real world evidence. And as we think about what the agency and all of us have learned over the past year, and we see this non-pandemic decision that the FDA has made and how our payers and clinicians and patients are reacting, what does that say to us about the future of what we can expect as it relates to that balancing point for providing access, particularly in circumstances where there really is no available alternative for patients, and the need to continue to learn? I don't know who wants to go first on that question.
I'm happy to jump in. I think that this underscores the criticality of looking to real world data and doing that in real time. we can't afford to wait 7 years to see the impact. And we know we have data at our fingertips that are going to tell us a robust story about what's happening. And, so for this and for other accelerated approvals, anything related to the post-marketing phase, using scientifically rigorous RWE can help build the evidence we need. It can inform decisions on the drug's risk, benefit, and value, and will also support payer decisions around coverage. And those would be, health plans here in the US, HTAs over in Europe. What are patients getting access to and when? And so as we increasingly integrate real world data into these decisions, we're partnering with organizations at Aetion, as an example, with ICER, who is starting to use our platform to integrate real world data, both at the time of drug launch and at regular intervals after a drug has been launched, so that we can start to contextualize what we're seeing and get a better sense of how we're assessing value and effectiveness of a given drug. And this will also help us to advance methods to ensure that we're continuing to generate relevant data. Amy's spoken about this. We'll get new types of data that will help us get a better sense of how well these medications are working over time, especially for populations who were not adequately represented in clinical trials.
Great. Anyone else want to answer that question?
I think I'll step in here, Tanisha, if that's okay. I can't comment on the specific aducanumab approval. That was not at FDA at the time that was announced. But I think there are three critical things that this highlights for me. I'll go back to my early point in today's session about continuous evaluation of a product across its lifetime. And I think the combination of the Biogen drug approval based on an accelerated approval and a surrogate endpoint, I think about the fact that our devices center, CDRH, has already made a very vocal statement about their focus on continuous evaluation of devices and algorithms across the product lifecycle. And so I think we're going to see more and more of total lifecycle evaluation, where there's one part of the approval process and then the expectation of continued evidence development across that. The second thing is that there's going to be co-needs. There's the need for regulators like the FDA, and then there's the need for payers. So CMS, you mentioned HTAs around the world. We also say at other payers. And so the ability to use new data sets and new forms of information to create answers that meet both of those needs simultaneously is, I think, what we're going to start to see more and more of. And the last thing I would say is that as we have new data sources, we're going to want to rely on real-world data and real-world evidence, but we're going to want to do so in a way that allows us to continuously add in new capabilities, such as new biomarkers, new radiologic information, new information about patient impact or health system impact in consecutive ways over time that allow us to make sense of these products in context. And that's going to be something that we're going to want to do in the future.
Thanks, Amy. Peter, if you don't mind, I wanted to actually transition to our third block, which is, and we got a great question on this, because this panel has been so inspiring relative to the future that we're going to all be in, hopefully sooner rather than later, not waiting till 2030. But a lot of people in this audience, and I remember being that doctoral student, just soaking up everything the panelists said. How do we make sure that we are training the future of leaders in our field to really take advantage of what you're saying? And we've heard partnerships, we've heard, which is something that, I don't know how well we do across different kinds of institutions. Peter, do you want to start?
Sure, it's so important. One of the things that we really focus on a lot here in our training programs is experiential training as much as anything. So, having what I would advocate for any of the trainees and those that are starting out is to really seek out the opportunity to not only use your training time to become very knowledgeable about the methods and the approaches and really develop that understanding and expertise, but also to find opportunities to apply that in real world settings so that you can there's nothing like doing a project where you've got to deal with some of the messy data and actually try to make sense of it and then apply it to solve a real world problem to teach you not only about how to use those methods, but also kind of what they're good for and what they're not, and what the reality is of the data that you're leveraging, especially in the case of real world data, which has a lot of warts and all that have to be sort of dealt with. So that would be one item of advice. The other is to and again, we try to do this here with our trainees, is to get a breadth of experience, because I think the opportunity to be able to work across platforms, across environments, is also very very helpful when you're training, so that you definitely want to focus in on a niche area and become quite expert in a particular area and find that nugget, that small valuable thing that you can really sink your teeth into and be able to leave your training having mastered. But you also want to try to understand that sort of breadth of experience as much as possible, so that then you sort of take that back out into the world. That would be my advice.
Thanks, Peter. We have a question from Lawrence Kleinman. With data more available and tools for using model neural analyses growing, oh my goodness, I just skipped there it is. How do we think about the balance between evidence and uncertainty as a way for making decisions, especially decisions that we may not be able to back out of? Seems to me worth embracing evidence and uncertainty equals hand in hand. I think this is a lot of what Amy, you and Carolyn were referencing relative to, like, it's not, RWE is not a nice to have anymore. It's going to be imperative relative to closing the gaps that other decision makers will have about the evidence of particularly new technologies coming to market.
Exactly. And, the more clear we can be where using data is a no-brainer, where we have demonstrated again and again that the methodology is sufficiently rigorous to be dependable, then let's put a stake in the ground and say, right, for CVOTs, where we're routinely capturing endpoints and claims, let's use data. In these other areas where it's less clear what's happening, let's continue to pressure test, let's continue to explore. And that way, I think we start to balance evidence with uncertainty, and we don't just wait until we have complete certainty on every aspect of all the decisions we're trying to make, but we are satisfied with incremental progress along the way.
Yeah. We have one final question that I think we're going to be able to get to, which is from a policy perspective, particularly research institutions who are funding research, is there a new mandate that these research institutions should have, like PCORI, and I should disclose I'm on the board of governors for PCORI, in order to have that level of transparency and not have black boxes? Like, where do we need to go from a transparency perspective?
So I'll start, Tanisha, and I'd love to hear from everybody else in the panel. The first part here is there needs to be a set of core principles of working together. And those core principles are going to need to come in a few forms. So one is, how do individuals, researchers, organizations, et cetera, communicate with each other? How do data sets get described in consistent ways? What are the consistent elements that need to be in a protocol, that need to be published online, that need to be actually in the publication? So there needs to be principles to working together and templates that make that easy. So that's one part of it. The second thing that I think we should start thinking about embracing in the future is what I call parallel processing. The idea that we now have data sets and scientific capabilities to allow us to run the same experiment multiple times and understand convergence and divergence of findings, and really stop to understand more about what does that tell us. If we have, for example, data sets that come from the claims environment, from electronic health records, merged data sets and linked data sets, and we run the same experiment and we get different answers, what does that tell us that's different about the underlying data and data sources versus consistency of methods? And we've got a lot of work to do there, I think, doing sort of the same analyses in parallel.
Thanks, Amy. Any other of our panelists? Carolyn and Peter.
Carolyn, I'll defer to you.
Yeah, I would just really echo what Amy said. I think the collaboration and the transparency and being really committed to airing skepticism that we have. Like, that's fine. Let's disagree with one another. Let's identify where we aren't positive that it makes sense to move forward. And then together we can figure out the best way to approach it.
Thanks, Carolyn. Peter, last comment of our panel.
Well, I really can't add a whole lot more to what's been said. I completely agree. I think there is a need for us to be able to, not create a false choice between sort of evidence and some of the sort of lower levels. It's about really being able to describe that, understand it, and speak to it more clearly. And I think maybe going back to the results from the last survey about communicating that, I don't think that can be emphasized enough. It's incumbent to us to be able to help contextualize and explain the evidence based on what it is that we're working with and what our methods were and what the data were, so that people that then have to use that evidence have a better understanding of the degree to which they can sort of leverage it for whatever decision they're trying to make. And I think that's a critically important area that we need more work in.
Thanks so much, Peter. With that, I'd like to thank the panelists. We probably could have gone another hour. Thank the audience for sticking with us, and let Lisa close.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Wow, what a conversation. That was really terrific. So thank you, Tanisha, Peter, Carolyn, and Amy. You have certainly given me, and I think our audience, a lot to think about. I also want to thank all our attendees for showing up on the first day of the ARM. But in case you're not dead yet, it's not over yet. For a little end of the day fun, we have a couple opportunities. So join us for either pub style trivia, and for the students, there's a virtual trivia night for you. So tomorrow morning we get started at 10 a.m. with additional networking and wellness sessions. And you can choose to start with a continue the conversation session tomorrow, which is a chance to further discuss the town hall on recommendations from the advisory group on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Or you might choose to join a coffee chat, or on either increasing engagement or impact, or stretch it out with morning yoga. I won't be in the yoga, I'll be somewhere else, but I'll see you tomorrow.